Today's tutorial is going to show you one way you can do a brim for your hat. You are going to need your round loom, however many pegs you need for the size of your project, a needle tool, and a number 6 skein of yarn. So first we are going to create a slip knot to get onto our anchor peg here. I am just wrapping the yarn around my fingers and pulling a loop through to create that slip knot. Then I'm going to attach it to the anchor peg. I'm going to briefly show you how to cast on this loom, but if this is something you aren't familiar with, definitely check out my other videos that will just teach you how to practice the cast on with using the E-wrap. This is peg number 1 and this is the last peg on my loom. I'm going to E-wrap my first peg by going behind it and just wrapping around the front and returning to the back, and then I will be moving on to peg number 2 by going up around the front and return to the back to go to peg number 3. I'm going to continue this until each peg on my loom is wrapped one time. Now I'm going to speed this up, but feel free to pause so you can catch up until you get to your last peg. So here I am rounding to my last peg and the yarn slips off this peg and I let go and it unravels more than half of my loom. And this is frustrating, but I left this in here so you guys can see that this happens. And it's pretty easy to just go back in to where it unraveled to and just jump right back in and E-wrap those pegs over again until you get to your last peg. I'm also going to point out that I have my loom turned up vertically because it's easier for me to wrap it, but feel free to keep yours laying flat on a table if that's more comfortable for you. I've just wrapped my last peg and I have my working yarn between the last peg and the peg number 1. I'm holding down the working yarn with my thumb while I bring all of the loops on my pegs down to the very bottom of the loom. I'm going to grab the working yarn and now I'm going to E-wrap starting at peg 1 and doing each peg on my loom. So here I am E-wrapping that first peg, and just as you did before, you will go the whole way around your loom until the very last peg. And that will leave 2 loops on each peg. And again, I'm going to speed this up, but feel free to pause until you have each peg wrapped twice. So now I'm coming around to my last pegs and I'm going to begin to knit off of each peg that I have wrapped twice. So I'm going to take my working yarn and wrap it around my anchor peg once and secure it under my left thumb. Now I'm going to go to the last peg that I wrapped and knit off of that one first by taking my needle tool, scooping it under the bottom peg and pulling it out and lifting it up and over the top loop and taking it off the peg. Now my working yarn is secure and I can move to peg number 1. So I'm going to take my needle tool, scoop it under that bottom loop, pull it out and lift it up and over the peg to knit off. And that leaves just 1 loop left on your pegs. So now I am coming around to my last peg and I have finished. So I have officially cast it on. Now I'm going to use my fingers to push all of the loops down to the bottom of my pegs. So now we are going to work on the body of our brim by just E-wrapping. So we're going to start with peg 1 and we're going to do as we did before by creating the second loop on each peg simply by E-wrapping each one. And once all of your pegs are wrapped twice, you're going to take that working yarn, wrap it around your anchor peg once, and secure it down by holding it with your thumb. Go to your last peg that you just wrapped and knit off of that last peg. You can let go of your working yarn now. It's pretty secure because you just knitted off the last peg. Go back to peg number 1 and you're going to knit off that as well as all of the other pegs that still have 2 loops on them by just taking your needle tool and scooping up that bottom loop and off over the top of your top loop and off of the peg. So now I've completed doing the first row of the body of my brim, and I am just going to go ahead and take my yarn off of that anchor peg, the one that I started with. You can just slip that off and tuck it in between your first and last peg and pull it through so it's just hanging there in the middle, so it kind of is out of the way now. And now we're going to take all of those single wraps on our pegs and push them down like we did before to the bottom of our loom. And we're going to go back to peg number 1 and begin to E-wrap peg number 1 all through our entire loom until we get to the last one again. Now we are going to continue to do this process by E-wrapping our pegs, knitting off of our pegs, moving the single loops to the bottom of the loom, and E-wrapping, knitting off, and moving our loops down until we get the length of our brim that is desired. So here soon I am going to skip ahead to having my brim the length that I want it to be. So if you watch this a couple times, you can pause till you catch up. I measure mine to be about 3 inches in this video. That is typically a little shorter than what I do in my actual hat project. I'm just doing this as a practice tutorial for you guys. So if you are creating this brim to actually start your hat project, then I would go ahead and maybe make it about 4 to 5 inches long before you flip it over to continue the next step. And here coming up, one of my loops slips off of my pegs. When I'm going to knit off, that top loop slips off, and that can be rather frustrating when that happens. So I left this in here so I can show you how I remedy this. It has fallen off my peg, but I can look and still see that that loop exists. So I sometimes will put my needle tool in the middle of that so I don't lose the loop. But all I'm going to do is use my fingers to kind of open that hole that's in the middle and pull that back up over the peg. As you can see, I need to kind of lift the other loops on the pegs beside it to give me a little more yarn to work with, a little more space, but then I can pull that up pretty easily and return that to the loom, and I'm going to be able to rewrap it and have no problem with that. So I'm just redoing it, and there we go, no problem. So if that happens to you, it can be remedied, not too bad, so don't get frustrated or worried. Just go ahead and give it a try and see what happens, because you're likely to encounter this a few times while you're loom knitting. You might as well learn how to go ahead and remedy that situation. All right, so now I cut ahead to when I have finished the desired length. Again, I normally will make my brims longer if I'm doing adult hats. You can see here it's about 3 inches from the inside of my loom, from the loops on the pegs to the end. Again, I suggest doing at least 4 to 5 inches if you're going to actually make this into a hat. If it's just practice, this isn't going to matter. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to kind of straighten out that brim there, and it's really important that I'm paying attention to the space in between my first and last peg. So if you flip it over, you can you can see the rows a lot better, and I'm just feeling my thumb and my middle or my pointer finger between that area and dragging them down, and I am able to grab a hold of a loop that is right there on the edge. I'm going to take that loop to the inside of my loom, and I'm going to put that loop onto peg number 1. Now I'm going to move right beside it, and there's going to be another loop. Then I'm going to grab that, and I'm going to place that onto peg number 2. Now these stitches are going to be a little loose, so you might want to hang on to them with your other thumb to keep them secure on the peg. So every time you put a loop on a peg, you're just going to move to the next stitch and place that loop onto your peg. Now make sure you are taking your time with this part, because when I was a beginner, I would maybe go through this too quickly and I would kind of lose track where I was. And sometimes I would skip a loop, or I'd use these loops to put on the wrong peg. And then I would find out at the very end when I didn't have a loop to place onto my last peg, which would make me have to take all the loops off, the top loops off of it, and redo it so they were all lined up correctly. So just make sure that you take your time doing this part so you don't have to undo these top loops and redo it. So now I'm coming around to the end of my loom where all the pegs are going to have 2 loops, and I'm getting ready to knit off, but first I have to do something with this string here. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to tuck it in between this brim so it hides it. So to do that, I'm going to take it, if you want to undo the knot on your slip knot, you may. Mine didn't come undone. I'm not worried about it because you won't see it. I'm going to line it up between the pegs that it kind of fits best in, and I'm going to take it and stuff it in between those bottom loops and top loops, which is going to hide it inside of the brim. So I'm just going to take all that yarn and stuff it in there. I'm going to try to use my needle tool to help me out, but it didn't work so well. So I'm just stuffing it in there before I knit off. As you can see, you can't see it from either side because it is hidden inside of the brim. And now we're going to move to knitting off. You guys already know how to do this. You're just going to take your needle tool under the bottom loop of your first peg, knit off the peg, and continue to do that until all of your pegs just have 1 loop left. And suddenly I'm having trouble with my needle tool. It's starting to bend on the handle. It's getting ready to break. So you'll see that I just switch out to a new one so I can continue with knitting off the rest of the pegs. And as you can see, I am coming back to the end of my loom, or that last peg. And guys, that is it. So now I have officially completed the brim. And if I were to continue with this, now I would just do the next steps to do the body of my hat, which you can just do with E-wraps. And we can do that in another video. Don't forget to like and subscribe.